I said, they're going to kill all of us.
This is a real story of survivors on a desert island.
Whether we come out of it alive or not, it didn't matter.
These men and their fellow Americans were left stranded and surrounded in the Pacific in World War II. Their commanders gave them up for dead.
We were expendable.
Against terrible odds, they endured bombardment, capture, and in some cases, execution. But despite it all, they won victories that inspired a nation.
Liquidate the enemy before he liquidates us.
Now, nearly a lifetime later, they've returned to tell their amazing story.
Yes, I'm back. Hi, guys.
It's been more than 6 decades since these men first arrived on Wake Island, little suspecting that what they were about to do here would change not only their lives, but the course of the war. Their step is slower now, but their memories remain undimmed. In 1941, it fell to these men and their comrades to win the first battle after Pearl Harbor.
Wake Island was the place where the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered.
And this one small outpost, manned by this small group of plucky Marines, gave the American people a hope that there would be a light at the end of the tunnel.
The Wake Island defenders were so badly outnumbered that Washington and Tokyo both regarded them as easy prey. Even the men themselves did not expect to survive.
This is my first time to be back on Wake in 61 years.
I've left part of my flesh here in 1941. I haven't found it, so I'm back here again this year.
61 years ago, we should have died on this island. We come back, and I think it's quite a victory for all of us.
This is my first return, but I'm going to disagree with John. I don't think we should have died here.
Because they did not die here, although many of their comrades did, they have come back to retrace the pivotal events that launched Wake Island into history. But why Wake Island? What made this little dot in the Pacific worth fighting for? Wake's 2.5 square miles of coral became American territory right after the Spanish-American War in 1898. No one had ever bothered to inhabit the atoll, which is made up of 3 adjacent islands, Wake, Wilkes, and Peel, ringed by a coral reef. But this desert island did have value.
What made Wake important strategically was it was big enough for you to build an airstrip to land airplanes and for airplanes to take off. That made Wake worth fighting for, worth dying for.
Wake was literally in the middle of a potential battleground between Japan and the United States. It was closer to Japan than to Hawaii, and only 600 miles from the Japanese Marshall Islands. And its location became vital in the 1930s because war between the two countries seemed ever more likely, especially after Japan invaded China and seized Manchuria in 1931.
Japan wanted to monopolize the trade of China for itself. The United States wanted open access to Chinese markets. The Americans also considered the Japanese to be brutal and aggressive. America turned away from colonialism while Japan was embracing it ever more tightly. So the two nations had conflicting interests, had conflicting desires, and that put them at loggerheads.
In 1935, tiny Wake Island was thrust into the middle of this showdown. Pan American Airways won approval from the U.S. Navy to build an airport there, a stop for its luxury Clipper flying boats going to and from Asia. Pan Am built a luxury hotel, promoted Wake as a fisherman's paradise, and the island became a stopover for the rich and famous. But for Japan, Wake was not an innocent tourist spot. It was a threat.
Like the U.S. Navy, the Japanese recognized that if commercial air can use Wake, the American military can use Wake. And since Wake sat only 600 miles north of the Japanese-held Marshall Islands, it was within bomber range of Japanese territory. That made it a threat.
Tensions rose further after war broke out in Europe in 1939. America moved to shore up its Pacific defenses and drew up plans to turn islands like Guam, Midway, and Wake into air and naval bases. For Japan, already considering war, that put Wake Island on the target list.
The Japanese knew that the Americans were building their own defensive ring with Hawaii and Wake as their western edge, and the Japanese knew they would have to take Wake Island.
In January 1941, American construction workers began arriving on Wake to build the seaplane channels, airstrips, roads, and bridges to turn the atoll into a military base. But workers like Bill Taylor weren't thinking about a war. They were thinking about the money.
I'm a child of the Depression. There were 7 of us in 2 rooms. This is what the Depression was. And there wasn't any money, and people were wondering what to do. You could come over here and make 4 and 5 times as much as you could make on the mainland. And the thing is, it was tax-free. And so we take the chance, and if you get caught, you get caught, you know, whatever. And we didn't think that we were going to get caught.
Within a few months, the civilians had company. In August, the first shipload of Marines arrived. America was getting ready for war.
I thought it was a miserable place to be, to tell you the truth, especially after we landed. Nothing but a bare area where our camp was supposed to be, and we had to set up our tents and everything else up that first day when we got here.
If the Marines were expecting an easy posting in the tropics, they were soon set straight by their commander. Major James P.S. Devereaux was only 5'5", but he ruled with an iron hand.
Devereaux came from an aristocratic background. Devereaux himself traced his descent back to the Earl of Essex, the paramour of Queen Elizabeth I of England. And when he got here, he behaved like a slave driver, pushing his men, working them 10 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. But that was also because he had a stronger sense of urgency about the situation than almost anyone else here.
Devereaux was a strict disciplinarian. I didn't like him.
He was regulation, to regulation, we felt, and he really didn't care about the men. We didn't feel, as a lot of the other officers were.
Devereaux knew it was a race against time for Wake to have enough guns in place to defend itself.
We weren't out bathing, I can tell you that. You didn't sit around the campfire and talk in the evening. It was strictly business.
The sense of urgency was being driven by Naval High Command at Pearl Harbor. If war was to come, the top brass believed, Wake would be on the front line. For the men shipped to desolate Wake Island, 1941 became a race against time. The likelihood of war with Japan was growing daily, and both sides had Wake on their strategic maps. 2,000 miles to the east, at Pacific Naval Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, the man in charge had Wake very much in mind. The Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, believed Wake would be on the front line of the coming war.
Kimmel thought Wake as the kind of first line of defense, like your pickets, your sentry posts, your listening posts, as he felt the Japanese would come and try to silence Wake first, and that would give him enough time to get his defenses in order and to go out and meet the Japanese.
But Kimmel could not fortify Wake as quickly or as strongly as he wanted.
Kimmel faced a number of obstacles in his efforts to develop Wake into a truly formidable outpost. One was his own president. Franklin Roosevelt was so determined to keep the British in the war, he was diverting American naval units and weaponry, etc., to the Atlantic.
The result was that by late 1941, Wake was not nearly well enough prepared to defend itself. It had just 525 military men, mainly Marines, plus about 1,200 civilians. And there were only 18 artillery pieces to protect an island with 20 miles of coastline.
And we were short of supplies, short of men. We had anti-aircraft batteries with no one to man them. And there was a lot of things that were missing for us to fight a battle with. We didn't have radar here. It was sitting on the dock in Pearl Harbor, as the story goes.
The government screwing around and waiting so long to get things done over here is a disaster to me.
I can remember isolationists had a slogan. We have an ocean east of us, we have an ocean west of us. Canada's friendly, Mexico's impotent, so why waste money on guns?
In early December, Wake did get some warplanes. The aircraft carrier Enterprise delivered a dozen Wildcat fighters to the island. But the Marine airmen were not exactly battle-ready.
The pilots did not have much experience flying these planes. They had never fired guns or dropped bombs from them. And the ground crew, most of the ground crew had really no experience in dealing with these aircraft. Most of them had little experience dealing with any kind of fighters, period.
Amid all the new arrivals was Navy Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham, sent to take overall responsibility for Wake above Major Devereaux.
He was affable, he was well-liked by the people who worked for him. He arrived at Wake just a few days before the war started and didn't get a chance to become familiar with the atoll's defenses.
Since October, Washington had been sending urgent cables to the Pacific Islands, warning of the mounting likelihood of war. On Wake, the Marines asked the civilian contractors to take instruction on how to fire machine guns, just in case.
I think it was a .30 caliber machine gun, and that was it. I just practiced on the thing. It didn't dawn on me. I guess I was just thick. But I don't think it dawned on almost anybody that anything was ever going to happen.
Many of the Marines shared those feelings.
Because we were stuck out in the middle of the ocean, a little doggone island all by itself, within 900 miles of the nearest island outside of us, and we thought we were going to be a backwater and that we would still be there by the end of the war.
And if war did come, the Marines felt they had little to fear from Japanese soldiers.
As long as you didn't get within 10 foot of them, they couldn't see you anyway. You had glasses, you know, like bottle ends, and I had a ridiculous notion of the Japanese.
I was with him. They couldn't see very far ahead, so you didn't worry they had to get up close.
But that was before December 7th, 1941. On that quiet Sunday morning, Japanese bombers devastated the American base at Pearl Harbor. In just 2 hours, they sank or severely damaged 18 vessels and 300 aircraft and killed more than 2,000 American servicemen. Admiral Kimmel had been wrong. The Japanese did not choose to begin the war in the outer islands like Wake. They had gone for the jugular in Hawaii. And now, with the American fleet crippled, Wake would have to face the Japanese alone. 2,000 miles to the west, it was already the morning of December 8th when news of the Pearl Harbor attack came through, and the bugle alarm was sounded.
We were all standing in the mess line waiting to get in a chow. As soon as that thing sounded off, we took off for the trucks and got off at our positions. I never did eat breakfast that morning.
Wake that morning was covered with dark rain clouds. And out of those clouds, just before noon, came a formation of 27 Japanese bombers. Wake was about to get the same treatment as Pearl Harbor.
The planes were coming down on the overcast, and broke through and started to cross. And I had my phones on, and the first thing I heard is, oh look, they're dropping their wheels. Actually, it was bombs. And then somebody else said, hold your fire, they may be friendly. Well, I recognized they were Japanese because of their insignia on that thing, and I hollered over the phone, friendly planes held, open fire.
The Japanese were heading for the Wake airfield, where the Marine fighter planes were parked out in the open. They were sitting ducks. The veterans returning to that airfield remember what it was like.
And when these planes came in, it was like they were gliding. And they just came in and they dropped their bombs and everything was just going up, and it was chaos.
They came right over the top of this and caught the whole line of Wildcats in a row, ready to be fueled. They got every one of them on the ground.
7 of the 8 Wildcat fighters on the ground were destroyed, and 32 U.S. airmen were killed or wounded.
Even under attack, they were going to try to take off again. Well, those are the ones that got killed in their planes.
We got fairly close and saw the one pilot playing right by the wheels of the plane. Dead, he wasn't moving. We started going a little further away. Then Major Baylor came along and he says, go back to the beach, get away from me. He didn't want to, he thought it was going to demoralize us or something.
The Marines' other 4 Wildcats had been up on patrol at the time, but hadn't seen the Japanese coming because of the rain and lack of radar. They landed later to a scene of carnage. And the military airfield wasn't the only one hit. The Japanese also went after the civilian airport.
The Japanese remembered Pan American. They came sweeping across the lagoon toward the Pan American facility. They bombed the hotel, they killed 10 Pan Am employees, and they also caught the Clipper here on a routine stop and perforated the roof with machine gun bullets.
On the ground, the Marines at their guns tried shooting down the Japanese bombers.
The concussion of the bombs really gave me more insight than the actual planes. I knew they were up there somewhere, but exactly where, I didn't know. And then as they came out of the fog, why, they made a perfect target for a 50-caliber machine gun. I was disappointed they didn't come down. They had suffered casualty personnel in their planes, so maybe our fire did have some effect.
The raid was all over in 7 minutes, leaving 45 Marines and civilians dead or wounded, and devastating the island's air defense.
It probably sunk in when they started digging the mass graves.
Everybody's life from the minute that they dropped those bombs was changed for the rest of their life. And you realize that you're in a situation there where you're maybe not going to get out of it.
Back on the mainland, still in shock over the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt himself now expected Wake to fall any day.
With the U.S. Pacific Fleet crippled at Pearl Harbor, nobody in the American High Command thought that Wake could hold out for long. President Roosevelt even tried to prepare the American people for its capture.
For the Wake defenders, the first air raid was just a taste of things to come. The Japanese bombers returned day after day, hitting every building they could see.
Some of the guys stayed in the barracks on the second day and they got bombed. And it's a dumb thing to do. You have to get out and, you know, dig a hole or whatever it is and go from there.
The siege of Wake Island had begun. Defenders now had to live every moment outside, on the beaches and in the brush. The Japanese had them hopelessly outnumbered, but the tables were about to turn. With Wake Island under attack from daily Japanese air raids, the Marines lived at their gun positions 24 hours a day, using whatever shelter they could find. Machine gunner Ralph Holowinski had joined the Marines to see exotic places, And now he was living on a beach.
I wanted to travel, and I'd been out of high school. I was 18. I talked to the fellow who'd been in the Army from my hometown, and he was stationed the same place as 3 years in, and I didn't want that.
During the bombing raids, Ralph and his buddies would head for the water's edge and find ledges in the coral reef that they could hide under.
This reef setting up there, we would sleep under that reef, and during the air raids, while we'd crawl under there, we picked our own spots, so if you was late getting to yours, why, you didn't take somebody else's. We had company under the reef. At night, there was rats here, and the rats were thick, and one of the Marines, he was laying there, he had a mustache, and the rat was licking the cheese off of his face and his mustache.
Find something I can recognize. Of course, after 61 years almost, it's very difficult.
John Johnson's home during the siege was this beach on the Wilkes Island section of the atoll.
Right now, I'm trying to orient myself as to where the gun positions were originally located. I'm just trying to estimate. They're on my map. If I remember right, we had the machine guns about 50 to 60 yards apart.
The open beach gave little protection from bombing raids.
And I think in a way we're angry. We sat here being bombed. We couldn't touch them. We were sort of endangered spectators. As the bombers came over, they could drop bombs and then fly home.
When he landed on Wake as a 19-year-old, John had already been a Marine for about 2 years.
I was 17 and a half years old, but I'd finished school, and at that time, the Marine Corps had less men than the New York City Police Force, so they were very selective. And maybe it was competitive. I wanted to see if I could get in where other people couldn't.
On this beach, he was in charge of a machine gun crew, including civilian volunteers.
We had belts of ammunition strung over each shoulder. The Marine and one of the volunteers carried the gun, where it could be set down and activated within a matter of seconds.
Many of the civilians who chose not to join the gun crews instead formed logistic support teams.
My position got quite a bit of help from them because they dug our dugouts and they helped us on the guns with the ammunition, a lot of that stuff.
Bob Hadinger, who manned a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun on this stretch of coastline, was 20 years old when he joined the Marines, a couple of years before coming to Wake.
I figured sooner or later there was going to be a war coming on. And jobs were hard to find in the city of Chicago at that particular time. It was towards the end of the Depression.
During the air raids, as Bob and his fellow gunners scanned the skies each day for incoming bombers, they did so without radar. But they got help from the remaining Wildcat fighters. The pilots flew up to meet the incoming Japanese and radioed their exact positions back to the waiting gunners.
We hit them almost every day and sent them off smoking. We don't know whatever happened to the food. There were a couple of times we saw parachutes way off to the west, and we don't know whatever happened to them. They landed in the sea, but we never saw any of their bodies.
The Marine pilots, thirsty for revenge, also attacked the Japanese squadrons head-on, even though they were often outnumbered 10-1. One pilot who especially loved dogfights was Captain Henry Elrod.
He was utterly fearless. He liked nothing better than getting in close with the enemy. During one air raid, he knocked down 2 Japanese bombers, 2 Nell bombers in rapid succession, and that's how he got his nickname, Hammering Hank.
Wake Island underwent 3 straight days of bombing, and then the Japanese changed their tactics. The assault no longer came from the skies. It came from the sea. Early on the morning of December 11th, 1941, 15 warships appeared on the horizon.
All of us were sound asleep when we got, and they woke us up. Somebody said they saw lights out to sea, and we couldn't believe that it was the Japanese at first.
Naturally, we were hoping they were our ships to start with, but and deep down, you knew they were not our ships.
The Japanese Navy had easily taken Guam the day before and expected a repeat at Wake. They sent an understrength fleet commanded by Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, and they didn't even bother to bring air support.
The first Japanese attempt to invade Wake was done on a shoestring budget because the Japanese were overextended across the Pacific. They sent up 3 older light cruisers, 6 destroyers, a couple of transports, a couple submarines, 450 landing troops. The Japanese came in here believing that this was going to be a pushover. Their aviators had reported that they had knocked out all the important marine defense installations.
They believed that with all the bombings that we'd had up until that time, the 3 days prior to that, that they flattened every bit of the defenses that we had, and actually they didn't hit a damn thing on none of the positions.
Major Devereaux knew he had only one real hope: to lure the ships within range of Wake's artillery.
He knew that cruisers had a longer range than his 5-inch seacoast guns, so he decided to hold his fire so the Japanese wouldn't sit beyond range and bombard Wake into submission.
Thinking they had nothing to fear, the Japanese ships moved in.
The Americans waited until the ships got closer, and they held their fire. They had their hands on those triggers, and they waited, and the ships got within range.
And the only command they were getting from Devereaux was, do not fire until you get the word from me. So it was a test of nerves for the Marines, and only someone as respected and feared as Devereaux probably could have kept them from opening fire.
Among those waiting on the shoreline were John Dale and Jack Skaggs, part of a 5-inch gun battery on Wilkes.
When is he going to let us fire? Because it looked like they was getting closer and closer.
Between 4,000 and 5,000 yards.
They said they came within 4,000 yards.
Yeah.
This one did. The cruiser on the north end was out 5,000 yards, which is still awfully close.
Yeah.
The reason they were standing here more than 60 years ago, watching those ships approach, is that they joined the Marines as teenagers. John Dale liked the recruiting officer's uniform.
I was 18 years old. That pretty blue uniform, and, you know, he looked terrific, and I thought probably in 4 years I would look like he did and have a pair of dress blues.
I was 17. I was a little bit disgruntled with school. It was in 1940, and I didn't see a lot of opportunities out there, and I could just see the Marine Corps was a great place to be. And I want to say now, with this one opportunity, it's the greatest thing I ever did.
On that December morning in 1941, John Dale watched the ships down the length of his artillery gun barrel.
And we only had one scope, and that was on the left side where I was seated. And they asked us to start tracking, and we could see them out, 9,000 yards, I guess, or more. And we kept wondering, why in the world don't they let us start firing one of these days? Of course, the commanding officer was right. He waited until they got down within between 4,000 and 5,000 yards.
Finally, at 4,500 yards, Devereaux's command post gave the command to the different strong points, commence firing, and then the Marines let loose. And the Japanese realized they had made the biggest mistake of their lives.
I coached the person on the right side. I told them left, 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 all the time.
getting the elevation that I needed. And when he got around to the correct position, I said fire, and the gun captain pulled the lanyard.
The results were almost immediate. Their shots tore into the middle of the destroyer Hayate.
A terrific explosion. You know, just the thing just lit up like a fire Roman candle. And it went down so quick I couldn't believe it. I've never seen movies or anything that where a ship went down that quick.
They surmised that they either hit their torpedoes, because it was a destroyer, or we hit something else, because it literally blew the back third of the fourth of the ship off. So that's why it sunk so early.
John and Jack's battery had taken 12 minutes to sink the first Japanese warship lost in World War II. It went down carrying 168 men.
It was blinding when that thing exploded, and I jerked the binoculars away from my eyes. When I looked again, the bow was just going under. I felt real good.
Wake's gunners let loose on the whole fleet, damaging at least 4 other ships.
Other Japanese ships get hammered, but as soon as they realize that they've been deceived by their own airmen, most of them are going to break and run for home.
They were stunned. They were dumbfounded. How could a small group of Marines with basically no weapons fend off this entire invasion force?
But for the Japanese ships, retreat did not mean safety. Because they had no air cover, they were now easy targets for multiple raids by the Marines' 4 remaining Wildcat fighters.
Our fighter planes would come in, get a 100-pound bomb each wing, reload with ammunition, go back and strafe them.
Someone, in fact, remarked that trying to sink a ship with a 100-pound bomb was impossible. Captain Henry Elrod, Hammering Hank, the squadron's leading hero, heard that, and he said, if it's impossible, it'll just take a little longer. Captain Elrod would drop a bomb on the destroyer Kisaragi, which apparently connected with a supply of depth charges. And it caused a chain reaction, which mortally wounded the destroyer and caused it to sink.
The Japanese had begun the morning expecting a cakewalk. Now they were in full retreat, with 2 destroyers sunk and damage to 7 other ships. More than 400 sailors were dead or wounded. On Wake, the day's casualty count was 5 wounded, none killed.
Kajuka was humiliated. He was angry. All across the empire, the Japanese were radioing victory, 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 victory. And here you have not victory. You have failure.
On Wake, the defenders were euphoric.
The morale went sky high right after that day of the 11th, because we thought our planes were just invincible, because they came back in after they strafed the other ships and told how they sunk one, another one, and so on.
The jubilation quickly spread well beyond Wake Island. Back on the mainland, Americans now had a reason to believe that they could win the war after all. The Wake Island Marines' stunning defeat of a Japanese naval fleet was cause for national celebration at home. A grateful President Roosevelt was able to announce America's first victory of the war.
There were only some 400 United States Marines who, in the heroic and historic defense of Wake Island, inflicted such great losses on the enemy.
Great joy in the U.S. People were finally happy they had good news from the Pacific Theater after all the string of really bad news.
The hopes and prayers of the American people became focused on this lonely strip of coral, and Americans said to themselves, if a small band of Marines can do that, wait until our entire nation mobilizes its full strength. Japan has no chance at all. Media pundits compared Wake Island to every big moment in American history. Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Valley Forge, of course, last stands like the Alamo. They just made a tremendous amount out of it.
We were being called the Alamo of the Pacific. Anybody that knew history knew what happened to the Alamo. And that didn't help us a damn bit.
No, it was quite a victory, but, you know, it's one of those things we didn't know. We realized that maybe it was a short-lived victory.
Short-lived indeed. Within hours, the Japanese renewed their bombing of Wake and came back almost every day. But at Pearl Harbor, plans were being laid for a rescue mission. Admiral Kimmel, shaken by the attack on Pearl, wanted to use Wake as part of a counterattack against the Japanese.
Well, Kimmel's been knocked down, but he's not out of the picture. He wants to fight back. He wants to defend Wake, use Wake as bait to draw the Japanese fleet out, use his remaining forces to score a vital victory against the Japanese and get his revenge.
Despite the carnage of the Pearl Harbor attack, Kimmel still had several ships available. His plan was to send 2 task forces to help Wake. One, headed by the aircraft carrier Saratoga, would carry a new squadron of fighter planes plus 400 extra troops, radar, and ammunition, and it would take the civilians off the island. A second force, led by the carrier Lexington, would head towards the Marshall Islands to divert Japanese attention from the main task force.
The stakes are huge at this point. If the U.S. forces, the Navy, marshals itself out to attack the Japanese, and the plan fails, it could be a second Pearl Harbor out in the middle of the Pacific.
But Kimmel did not get to see his plan through. On December 16th, he was fired, a scapegoat for the Pearl Harbor attack. Wake had lost its biggest supporter.
He was replaced by Admiral William S. Pye, who had been the commander of the battle force, had his flagship, the USS California, sunk from beneath him at Pearl Harbor. Pye was gun-shy. He was never really committed to saving Wake from the beginning.
But going against his own instincts, Pye allowed the relief mission to go ahead, at least for now.
He had inherited Admiral Kimmel's staff. Those officers were fiercely loyal to Kimmel and his vision, and they opposed every argument they could and persuaded Pye to keep the relief effort going.
The battle for Wake became a race. Both sides were sending naval forces towards the island, and it was a matter of who would get there first. On December 21st, the Japanese let the defenders know that they had won the race to Wake Island. Planes from nearby Japanese aircraft carriers, some of the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, began pounding Wake.
I think we all figured that once the carrier planes came around, at the beginning of the end, it was about ready to come, and that we were going to be under another really good, strong battle.
After the humiliation of his first naval attack on Wake, Admiral Kajioka had returned with a far greater force. This time, he meant to win.
They had destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, over 100 planes, dive bombers, fighters. They were going to take this island.
The Japanese squadron included the famous airman Noboru Kanai, the bombardier who had demolished the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. By now, the Marines were down to their last 2 fighter planes, but the pilots still flew up to meet the attackers. On December 22nd, Captain Herbert Freuler and Lieutenant Carl Davidson piloted the 2 Marine planes. Davidson was shot down over the sea, but Freuler made a famous hit.
The bright shining moment is the revenge against Pearl Harbor that occurred on this day. Captain Freuler is credited with shooting down a bombardier who has traditionally been credited with dropping the bomb on the Arizona, Warrant Officer Noboru Kanai. His pilot, himself, and his rear gunner all went down to the sea and were never seen from again.
Freuler, wounded in the shoulder, managed to guide his plane back to Wake, but the plane was too damaged to fly again. The Marines had run out of planes altogether. Meanwhile, Wake's defenders were wondering why the promised relief force hadn't arrived. The Saratoga Task Force was only 500 miles from Wake, less than 2 days away, but it had stopped for 24 hours to refuel, a critical delay. On Wake, everyone knew the Japanese would try another invasion at any moment. In preparation, the men continually reminded each other that Marines never surrender. They'd all seen the newsreels of Japan's conquest of China in the 1930s, where thousands were executed, including civilians.
The Nanking, I think, was in the world's mind. That was the first exposure of Japanese brutality. They're not taking prisoners, men, women, or children.
I don't think there was ever a Marine Corps unit that ever surrendered. And that was our feeling, that we would never surrender. We'd battle to the last man, and that was it. Whether we'd come out of it alive or not, it didn't matter.
That resolve was about to be tested. Early on the morning of December 23rd, they noticed familiar shapes in the distance.
On that horizon there, we counted 42 ships, and they were big ships. They were like battleships, they were cruisers, they were aircraft carriers and destroyers.
In the back of my mind, it kept throwing at me that we would probably be killed this time. I'm sure they wouldn't. If they got a foothold on the island, I'm sure they'd keep pouring more men onto the island.
I thought was there's 150 million Americans. Of that group, there's 20,000 that are Marines. Of that 20,000, there's 400 and something. How in the world did I wind up on this place?
For the Japanese troops aboard the fleet, the time had come to transfer to their landing craft.
An officer told us we were heading into enemy territory and that we were all expendable. He brought out a barrel of sake and said, "You'd all better have a drink of this."
This tiny little island of Wake kept this entire Japanese fleet at bay and drove them away, send them packing. So the second time when they came back for revenge, they had fire in their eyes. They wanted blood.
In the dark, the first wave of 900 Japanese landing troops headed towards the south shores of Wake and Wilkes Islands in converted destroyers, landing craft, and rubber boats. The Marines and civilians could only wait and think.
There was no chance of reinforcements, too.
We knew we was on our
We knew
own.
that we were on our own, that, you know, that we had to make it ourselves.
Looks like a schoolboy having a fight with somebody. Let's just slug it out for a while and see how we come out on this. Whether they're as good as they think they are, if we're better than we think we are.
The defenders would not have to wait long. The issue would be decided that same morning. December 23rd, 1941. Dawn was still 3 hours away when boats carrying 900 Japanese troops approached the southern shores of Wake Island. The defenders were ready for them. Just as the vessels hit the shore, the men turned on their searchlights.
This is one of 6 60-inch high-intensity searchlights that the Marines had on Wake. And early on December 23rd, when it was pitch black dark, and they thought they heard the thrum of engines over the surf, 3 of these units on the south shore of the atoll were flicked on, and they instantly turned the night into day. And they were able to reveal Japanese landing troops approaching in landing craft and rubber boats. The Japanese shot out 2 of these, and the third failed when its generator conked out, but it provided vital illumination.
Ralph Holowinski was stationed on the beach that morning, ready to face the enemy with his machine gun. But at the last minute came a change of orders that would change his life.
This was the last time I ran in my life, was from the beach here up to the bushes. never ran since.
Ralph would never run again because of what happened next. From the beach, he was sent to this area further inland, where he helped to man a 3-inch artillery weapon.
Well, it looks almost about the same right in through here. Everything the same except a little more peaceful now.
The artillery piece that Ralph was now manning was pointed directly at the incoming Japanese boats.
Lieutenant Hanna come by and he says, I saw the ships there quite close in, and so I went with him to the 3-inch gun. He says, well, you operate the controls and I'll do the set the shells and so on.
Ralph's gun crew wrought devastation on the Japanese landing troops.
The ships came right in ashore, put it directly from our gun out to the water, and they was right in line. Of course, when we hit it, it blew and it lit up the sky. And then when the second ship came, of course, took my eyes off of that one and concentrated on shooting at the second ship. Well, this is just great. I mean, we're way ahead of them.
And you almost feel sorry for the Naval Landing Force guys when they were dropped from their ships. Can you imagine the ship grinds ashore here and guys climbing on top of you, and you've got your rifle, your gas mask strapped to your back, your bread bag, canteen, ammunition pouch, and it's pitch black. You can't see what's going on.
That makes you a sitting duck for Marine machine gunners who are all along here who begin lacing this area with tracers. According to one Japanese interpreter, about 300 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force men were slaughtered in this sector of the battlefield.
飛び込んで80メートルぐらい泳いで岸に着いたんです。
I jumped into the water with my rifle and ammunition and waded about 80 yards until I reached the shore. Our unit leader was killed directly in front of an enemy position by a machine gun round. We couldn't advance because of all the machine gun tracer fire. We just hugged the ground and could do nothing but stare at the scene.
Japanese troops who did survive the landing took their attack into the thick brush behind the beaches.
Fighting when the Japanese come ashore is vicious. It's hand-to-hand. The Japanese battle tactic calls for bayonet charges, called a totsugeki. And the idea is to close with the enemy, take him with your bayonet, break his lines, coming from the side and attack from the back. The Marines, on the other hand, are behind emplacements. They have heavy machine guns, and they're just laying waste to the Japanese as they advance. The Japanese had a saying that life is lighter than a feather, duty is heavier than a mountain. So when you come to the position where my advancing will result in my death, there's no hesitation, there's advance.
Shortly after dawn on Wilkes Island, John Johnson was leading his machine gun crew, including civilians, in search of invaders.
This was the thing, I guess, that I'd really been waiting for, a face-to-face firefight. I don't know, I had a peculiar feeling that rather exalted, like we're in charge now.
As soon as they entered the brush, they came under fire.
We immediately returned fire, concentrated fire, and we heard one scream, but again, we didn't know if there was more than one person or what we had hit until we advanced far enough to come on 4 dead Japanese soldiers. I was astounded. I looked at them, and I had a lot of different emotions. I knew they weren't the pilots, but they were the people that represented the pilots that had harassed us so much and had scared us so much. I thought, and there they are, helpless.
All over Wilkes Island, the defenders were getting the better of the invaders. John Johnson's crew linked up with other Marine patrols, and they cornered the remaining Japanese on Wilkes. Johnson discovered about 30 of them crawling under a truck for protection. He was hoping to take at least some of them prisoner.
And about that time, we got a burst of fire from those underneath the truck, killing the fellow next to me and grazing one arm. I won't say I was angry, but I thought this was a time to act. So I started firing underneath that truck, putting about 400 rounds of ammunition into them. I guess we're trained in the military. We can be humane, but on the other hand, we have to do what we're trained to do, and that is liquidate the enemy before he liquidates us.
By around 8 a.m., the defenders had already won the battle on Wilkes.
On this first sweep of the island, we confirmed there was no other enemy alive. So when you have no enemy, you're the winner.
The Marines and their civilian helpers had killed more than 90 Japanese and lost just 10 of their own.
I saw Marlowe, even though he wasn't a close friend of mine or anything. I think you're just numb, but when you saw him, you hated to see it. You know, he's dead, and he's 19 years old.
Across on the main island of Wake, the defenders were repelling the invaders. Ralph Holowinski and his colleagues had switched from firing their artillery gun to using rifles against the onrushing Japanese.
There was a Jap stood up, and he was about, from here to the bush there, about 20 feet. And he had his rifle up or so. Started bringing it up. Well, about that time, I fired, and he was that close I could see the blood come off of his forehead. And he went down and racked another shell in and was waiting, and another Jap stood up. And he looks on both sides, and where his buddy was, he never did look straight ahead first. What he did, why, I plugged him, and he went down.
Near Ralph's position, the Marine airmen, with no planes left to fly in, became foot soldiers and were just as effective on the ground. Hammer and Hank Elrod helped lead a counterattack.
Hank Elrod got to his feet, Tommy gun blazing, screaming, "Kill the sons of bitches!" and broke that charge. He killed a Japanese machine gunner, threw his Thompson to a comrade, picked up the machine gun and continued to fight with that.
But as Elrod was throwing a grenade, he was hit and killed by Japanese crossfire. Posthumously, he became the first Marine of the war to receive the Medal of Honor. The defenders were winning the battle on the ground, but they were coming under heavy bombardment from the air. One plane zeroed in on Ralph Holowinski and the two civilians who were helping him.
A couple planes came over then about then. Rear gunner was real low. I mean, he was low enough, I mean, I could see his goggles. Well, the first pass he went by, why, he got me in my legs, and it was like hot knife cutting flesh. And he circled, came back, and he got me in the other leg. And in that pass, he got both the civilians, and Gay, I saw his body go off the ground 6-8 inches. He had that many shells in his chest. It was bounced up and down.
As Ralph lay bleeding from leg and back wounds, he thought he was dying.
Came to my mind was the movies that was playing in them, and where's the cowboys, the Indians were surrounding the cowboys, and now where's the cowboys coming from again? Where aren't they? And I was looking for the Marines to come off a ship and save us. Didn't happen. I might say this, I was ready to go. And the thoughts went back home to my folks, wondering if they'd ever know how it happened to me.
As Ralph waited in vain for the arrival of the cowboys, his fellow Marines were thinking the same thing. Where was the promised rescue fleet? All morning long, Commander Cunningham had been frantically radioing Pearl Harbor, trying to find out.
After the Japanese landed, Cunningham sent two messages to Pearl Harbor. The most famous one was, "Enemy on island, issue in doubt." And those words, while being very honest, also caused Admiral Pye in Pearl Harbor to decide, well, if the issue is in doubt, it would be unwise to risk the Saratoga and the U.S. Navy's remaining ships in the Pacific on what looked to be a lost cause.
Admiral Pye, never keen on the rescue mission anyway, decided to call it off. The two naval task forces would not engage the Japanese Navy. The men on Wake would have to fend for themselves.
The last thing Pai wanted was to lose any more ships. The Navy had already suffered a serious blow, but the Navy never forgave Pai for recalling that relief force. He would never receive a major combat command for the rest of the war.
The sailors and Marines aboard the rescue force that was headed from Hawaii out to Wake Island were furious when the orders came to turn back and head back to Hawaii. Especially angry were the Marines, who were going out to rescue your brothers and get revenge against the Japanese.
We realized it wasn't coming, and that's when I had the outlook that we just weren't possibly sacrificing other ships for it. We were expendable.
They stopped and they fueled a destroyer that was out there, and they fiddled around, and we never did get the planes. You didn't get anything.
The Wake Island defenders had been hailed as national heroes, but now in the crunch, they were deemed not worth the risk. Their fate was in their own hands. Even as the Wake Island Marines and civilians battled the invading Japanese on December 23rd, they got word that Pearl Harbor had canceled the promised rescue mission. Yet without reinforcements, the men on Wake had pulled off another improbable victory. They had beaten back the initial Japanese assault.
The first wave of the Japanese landing force had been fought to a standstill. About half a company had been wiped out on Wilkes Island, and the Japanese troops on the main island had suffered heavy casualties, and they were being pushed back by a Marine counterattack.
But although the Marines and civilians were winning, their victories went unnoticed by their own commanders. Throughout the morning's fighting, Major Devereaux was in this command bunker trying to coordinate the battle, but his phone lines to the rest of the island had been cut.
When Devereaux lost contact, he just assumed that the Japanese had overrun those positions, that those Marines were dead or captured. It never occurred to him that the telephone lines had merely been cut, that his men were doing well, and he never came out of the command post.
When Devereaux finally did emerge from his bunker later that morning, his pessimism grew. He saw Japanese battle flags flying all over the island.
The Japanese tied what they call their yosegaki flags, their signed flags, to the rifles to show the commanders where they're at, their positions are. This goes back to the samurai days. And Devereaux may have seen these flags and thought to himself, it's over.
Devereaux had always drummed it into his men that Marines never surrender. But now he had to consider breaking that cardinal rule.
While Devereaux is sitting here, Commander Cunningham informs him that the relief expedition from Pearl Harbor had turned back. And Devereaux and Cunningham, combining the bad news that they both have, the two of them eventually realize that further resistance is going to be futile. Cunningham and Devereaux played a game of hot potato. Neither one of them wanted to say we should surrender, and after about an hour or so, Cunningham will make the final decision that the atoll should surrender.
Despite winning the battles that morning, Wake's remaining 476 servicemen and 1,117 civilians would have to entrust their lives to the mercy of the Japanese, who had a reputation for not taking prisoners.
The beheadings, the tortures, the cruelty towards prisoners was going to be falling on the Marines' heads next. And Cunningham knew he had Marines, he had civilian contractors. It just must have been an agonizing decision to make.
The deciding factor for Cunningham and Devereaux was that although Wake had fought off the first 900 invaders, the two men assumed correctly that many more were still waiting to come ashore, backed by heavy cruisers and carrier planes.
If Commander Cunningham had not made the decision to surrender, there's a very good chance that every American on Wake would have been killed. The Marines and the other defenders would have gone down fighting, and the Japanese, having sustained so many casualties, probably would have been whipped up to a blood frenzy, and there's a good chance they would have killed any of the civilians they got their hands on.
Cunningham made the formal surrender, and Devereaux, accompanied by Japanese troops, began touring the island with a white flag, telling his men to lay down their arms. His men were astounded. they had just won the battle.
It was a state of shock. I just stood there and looked at him. I didn't even reply. He said, "Tell your men to lay down their weapons. It's an honorable surrender." And I don't know why that affected me so much. When he said honorable surrender, is like 1,000 pounds went off my head, and I thought, I'm not going to die today.
I'd heard that Marines just didn't surrender, and I just didn't see how you could do it or how it could be accomplished. I mean, the Japanese had never taken prisoners.
Depressed, very depressed. We never thought that we would ever surrender. I still think we should have fought to the last man to this day. And I thought our tradition went to hell as soon as we surrendered.
But despite the mixed emotions of the defenders, there was general agreement that they could not have resisted forever.
No, that was not an option. I don't feel at all. If they hadn't have succeeded that day, they would have been back with 5,000 troops because they wanted Wake, I think, at any cost.
Having surrendered, the Marines and civilians now faced the unknown. What would the Japanese do with them? The first signs didn't look good.
We were stripped and tied together with telephone wire in 15-men groups and facing the machine guns at the bunkers for about 3 or 4 hours. We were out there and we were trying to hold each other up, and every time somebody would move, they'd choke because they had a noose around our necks with our hands tied behind our backs. So every time we relaxed our hands, it would tighten up on the noose, and each one of us were tied together, 15 in the group.
The Japanese decided not to execute their prisoners immediately. They marched all 1,600 of them from points around the island to here, the airstrip, and herded them into one big group.
That's where the airstrip went.
Now, this was all...
Revisiting the airstrip more than 60 years later, the veterans remembered thinking how that day of surrender might be their last one on Earth.
I just thought that would have been inevitable. They were, machine guns were pointing at us, and that was it. They were herding us together in one great big group so they could kill us all at once.
Everybody was ordered to come out. And when they came out, well, a lot of the guys, they started stripping off because that's what the Japanese wanted. My brother was one of them, and he was in a truck, and he says, "What do you think they're going to do to us?" I said, "They're going to kill you. These guys are going to kill us." They had their fingers on the machine gun, and you're just hoping that some guy didn't go screaming and everything break loose.
Some of the Japanese, I think, hinted that they thought they were going to kill us. They'd never taken prisoners. Why would they take us?
Just a few hours earlier, they had been winning a battle. Now the men sat at the airport wondering why they had ever surrendered. They needed a miracle rescue, and suddenly it came from the most unlikely source. Admiral Kajioka, the very man who'd led the attack on them that day, arrived at the airstrip and ordered the officer in charge to call off the execution. Tokyo wanted to spare the Americans.
Kajioka, he got in an argument with the commander of the fighting men, and they were out there battling their heads off about what. But the admiral had his way, and the only way he got it is they got it from Tokyo not to kill us. And that's just how close it came.
The machine guns were taken away, and a Japanese interpreter announced, "The Emperor has gracefully presented you with your lives."
The Japanese knew that Wake Island was a highly publicized event, and if hundreds of Marines and hundreds of civilians were suddenly to disappear, it would be a war crime, an atrocity the Japanese could not hide.
We were colder than a devil because we were stark naked, and we went to the pile of clothes to put on the clothes that we tried to get. I got a hold of a guy's clothes that was clear out to here and one corporal's shirt. I never did get my shoes back.
The only thing I had on was my shorts. And they brought us here, and I found a pair of 46 overalls, a white shirt, and a pair of Lorseim shoes.
Dressed now in each other's clothes, the men were kept outside near the airstrip for 2 days and nights.
Miserable. You got sunburn in the daytime, and at night you'd probably get a shower.
And freeze to death.
I felt for those that had no trousers, had no shoes, had no socks, because I was miserable and I had that.
The only water they got came from old gasoline drums.
Then on the 23rd, when they gave us the cup of gasoline tainted water, a slice of bread, and told us that we would be considered prisoners, I'm not sure whether it was the happiest Christmas I ever had or the worst.
Ralph Holowinski, who'd been badly wounded, was carried to the airfield on a stretcher, where an American doctor told him not to mention that he'd been at the site of the 3-inch gun that had done so much damage during the Japanese landing.
Our doctor walked around and says, remember, you weren't on that gun back there. And he walked around and said several times. Well, later we found out that the interpreter had told him that they was going to kill the people that were on that gun, execute them.
After 2 days of living on the airstrip, the men were moved into whatever buildings were left from the bombing.
I didn't realize till they moved us into the civilian barracks that wood could be so soft.
3 weeks after the surrender, a Japanese transport ship, the Nitamaru, arrived at Wake. More than 1,000 of the men were ordered to go aboard. The next chapter of their saga was about to begin. The defenders on Wake Island had fully expected to die in December 1941. But now they were being shipped to a prison camp in Japanese-controlled China.
This is the rules and regulations for boarding prisoners of Japanese prison ships. The heading is Commander of the Prison Escort, Navy of the Great Japanese Empire. The prisoners disobeying the following orders would be punished with immediate death. Carrying unnecessary luggage and baggage and embarking. The reason I'm laughing, I had a handkerchief. They took that away from me. Those using more than 2 blankets. I didn't remember seeing any blankets.
Me either.
The men were herded into a crowded hold for the 12-day trip to China.
For facilities, we had one 5-gallon can in one corner, another 5-gallon can in the other corner with the open wood, and that was our head. And the way they fed us rice gruel twice a day. It wasn't enough to feed a doggone midget, much less a bunch of men.
The guards would come in. I really don't know of any reason, but they would just pick out 1 or 2 people and start beating them. We had a fellow in our battery on Wake, and he had a serious back wound. A bullet had grazed his back. The first time in the war, I cried, and I cried for that man because he's up there with that back injury, and they were beating him across it.
At one point during the voyage, the guards took 5 Americans up to the deck, and their colleagues never saw them again. Although the story did not emerge until after the war, the 5 men were singled out for having ties to the Marine Air Squadron that inflicted so much damage on the Japanese back on Wake. The Japanese wanted revenge.
They took them up on deck, put a cover over their head, and there was 5 or 6 Navy warrant officers doing a samurai or Bushido party to kill your enemy. But they said there was no crying, no outcrying. They had the sack over their head, and it was done so quick that no one made a sound.
In January 1942, about 1,200 Wake defenders arrived at a Shanghai prison camp. The Japanese filmed them to show the world they had Americans in captivity. Commander Cunningham was obliged to make a statement.
Cunningham speaking. I have a message for the President of the United States. In the face of superiority, we were obliged to give up Wake Island. Since our capture, we have been well treated, and I wish to thank the people of the Japanese nation for their consideration.
To the Japanese, the Americans were men without honor.
They were actually treating us like slaves.
We were beneath contempt because we were captured, and they treated us like dirt because we were the ones that surrendered.
As virtual slaves, the men were put to work to help the Japanese war effort. A lot of the work was hard labor, moving huge quantities of earth for construction projects.
I think eventually we got up to almost 50 feet on those things. And when, you know, pushing that kind of an incline, I mean to tell you, 12 hours on that was terrible.
That was the thing that actually killed men. I mean, there's no way about it. They didn't stab them or bayonet them or shoot them, but they literally starved and worked them to death.
We had cracked wheat. It had little worms in it. That cracked wheat had been shipped out by the Red Cross to China in 1937, and now this is 42. And a lot of the guys say, "Do you have meat in your wheat this morning?" And a lot of the guys didn't pick them out; they ate them.
Despite their deprivations, the Wake Islanders had among the best survival rates of Allied POWs in the Pacific. One reason was their mental toughness and unity, bred during the siege on Wake.
Comradeship, that they said if you fell down, somebody's going to pick you up. You just weren't going to lay there and walk away from you.
Well, I belonged to a gang, and I expect most of the fellows did. There were 5 of us that were real close. We took care of each other, and to me, that was a great source of strength, the 5 fellows.
The prisoners also kept up their spirits by taunting the Japanese guards.
One of the British wrote a little song about Charlie McCarthy, 4'2". He feeds us daily on rice and stew. Oh, Uncle Sam, where are you? And the Beast of the East got all of it. So this is very good, very good. Who wrote it? I cut his head off.
Not all the Wake Island defenders were sent to the camps. Some remained here on the island. More than 350 civilian contractors were kept behind to build fortifications for the Japanese, like this bunker, in case of an American attack.
They kept these highly skilled Americans on the island afterwards. One of the reasons is, if you have Japanese Naval Landing Force troops, they're trained to fight. They're trained to kill. They're not trained to build. They don't know how to grade. They don't know how to build airstrips. They don't know how to move heavy pieces of equipment. And so the American contractors made facilities like this one, which is basically a beach defense. When the Japanese came under attack, they would enter the bunker through these concrete and coral reinforced walls. Entering the bunker, they'd be protected by heavy rebar reinforced concrete walls, a huge mound of coral on top to protect them from bombardment. And once inside, they were really safe. And once they were safely deep inside the bunker, the crews would man their heavy artillery or machine gun positions in here, firing through this aperture that was facing directly towards the beach. So the anticipated American landing craft, the barges, would have to come up right on this beach, fully exposed to heavy machine gun fire.
The Japanese were so sure the Americans would launch a counter-invasion of Wake that they imported this 8-inch gun from Singapore to protect their newly won turf.
When Wake fell on December 23rd, it became the easternmost stronghold in the Japanese Empire. And the Japanese expected that the Americans would take it back, or at least try. So they brought in about 4,100 troops, and they also brought in additional armament to withstand an amphibious assault, which never came. The Americans island-hopped Wake. They knocked out the air power here, they cut it off from resupply by sea, and they turned it into a self-guarded prison camp. The only Americans who came by were new carrier air groups who would use Wake for live target practice before they went after more important targets. In fact, a young George H.W. Bush flew his first combat mission here and, of course, later became 41st President of the United States.
Wake Island, as the planes from an American task force approach it. The Japs are taken completely by surprise.
But even as American planes bombed Wake, there were still American civilians on the island below. By 1943, the Japanese had shipped most of them off to prison camp, but had kept 98 construction workers. Those 98 men created their very own personal monument on Wake, and their fellow civilian Bill Taylor went back to visit it.
This is a 98 rock, and you'll see that there's a date on here in May of 1943. I could just see these guys sitting over here, maybe not the whole crew, but there they were sitting over there, and this guy comes up and he starts scratching on this thing, and they had to work for the Japanese, and I don't know how anybody could feel like I am doing this against my will so that my own countrymen are going to be destroyed when they try to come in here. And I think they were cussing about it, and they were sick about it, and they couldn't do anything about it.
The PW Rock would soon become an epitaph for those prisoners. The island was running out of food, and the Japanese garrison could not even feed themselves.
We were put on quarter rations. My weight dropped from about 135 pounds to only 88 pounds. And I was better off than most. One guy dropped to 62 pounds. As he was being examined, he died right there and then.
More than 1,000 Japanese died on Wake during the occupation from enemy action and also the effects of starvation.
Faced with starvation, angry about the American bombing, and believing an invasion might be imminent, the Japanese commander on Wake, Admiral Shigematsu Sakabara, decided to take revenge. He took it here, on the island's northern shore. Bill Taylor has pieced together what happened to his former civilian comrades.
On October the 6th and 7th of 1943, one of the most tragic events of the history of this island took place. It was so sad because at that time, the Americans had a task force out off the island here, and they came in all day on the 6th, and they just hammered away at this island. They were blowing up everything. The Japanese were so frustrated. We had 98 men who were our friends, had been working for the Japanese under pressure. They were marched out on this road, and they were told that they were going to go home. They had them kneel down right here on this strip that we're standing right here. They had them kneel down with their hands behind their back. And then they blindfolded him. And I don't think that there was a man there that didn't know that he was going to be killed. And then off to my left, up here, out of the bushes, guys came out here, they set up their machine guns. And Sakabara right over here, he raised his hand. And so they started firing. And so they killed every one of them, bayoneted them, and that was it.
It was feared the U.S. was going to invade, so the POWs were killed. An order was given to kill the POWs, and the order came from above.
The fate of the 98 men remained a secret, unknown to anyone outside Wake, for 2 full years. It was not until American forces recaptured the island at the end of the war that the truth was finally discovered.
On this tiny island, 1,200 miles from Hawaii, 443 United States Marines stood guard in early December 1941.
It didn't take long for Hollywood to turn the defenders of Wake Island into box office heroes. Paramount Pictures began making the film version even before the island fell, because the Wake siege had captured the public imagination.
Yes, the island fell, but by then America was so worked up that the giant had been awoken, that we were going to go back and retake our islands and go and take Japan and accept nothing less than unconditional surrender.
The real Wake Island veterans stuck in prison camps in China and Japan, didn't realize their story was on the silver screen, or that Hollywood had decided to change the ending.
Tell him to come and get it.
It was sensationalized and sentimentalized. The men who actually fought at Wake, for instance, were extremely surprised to come home and see that they supposedly were all killed while trying to fend off the Japanese. What did you think of the movie Wake Island when you first saw it?
First thing, we didn't have a dog.
Yeah, that's number one.
And Brian Dunleavy, even though he was a good movie star, there was nothing real about the movie whatever.
A lot of war bond drives occurred at the movie theaters. People would come to go see the movie. They'd be so pumped up with enthusiasm and patriotism, they'd exit the movie theater and there'd be war bond sales right there, and people would buy war bonds, and it helped the war effort tremendously.
Meanwhile, in the prison camps in China, the Wake Island defenders were making drama of their own. Several attempted to escape, including Commander Cunningham, who escaped and was recaptured twice. Others were more successful, and one of them was Bill Taylor.
I had a hacksaw blade in my pants, and I prepared for it. I had a map of China.
In 1945, Bill was part of a work detail traveling on a Japanese prison train heading north from Shanghai towards the Yangtze River. He and a fellow prisoner, Jack Hernandez, hatched a plan to escape through the window.
I told Hernandez, I said, work on that, see if you can get that barbed wire off the window. If you can, let me know. The first thing I know, Hernandez sat down, he came down and sat, and he said, we're all ready to go.
Taylor and Hernandez waited till the guards weren't watching, then climbed out the window and hung onto the side of the train, looking for the right spot to jump.
The greatest feeling that you'd had in years on end is when you saw that caboose go by and the two red lights. And I felt so happy about it. And maybe if I'd known where I was, I wouldn't have been so happy, because we were in a large contingent of Japanese soldiers. I went over to get Jack. I said, let's get out of here. And he says, I can't go. He says, I think I broke my leg. So I took down and I said, you can't break your leg. This is not the time to break your leg, not time. He says, I can't get up. And he said, well, you got to go, because you know we're both going to get caught. Well, I did. I left. That's the hardest thing you'll ever do in your life when you're, you know. I took off and they caught him. But they did all right. They fixed his leg and he went through the war.
Taylor made his way across China, sleeping in wheat fields and at one point fending off 2 Chinese soldiers working for the Japanese army. He found sanctuary with Chinese communist soldiers, who were also enemies of the occupying Japanese.
He says, you're okay now. We're friends of the Americans. He says, we'll try to get you through. Well, we had to travel a long ways. Yeah, about 2.5 months, and I just lived with them. They saved my life.
After about 10 weeks traveling with the communists, Bill was able to make phone contact with American forces in the region, who sent in a plane to take him to their base in northern China.
I looked up there, about 200 yards away was an American flagpole, and a flag was flying on it. And after 3.5 years, man, there was nothing sweeter in the world to see that American flag.
As he was about to leave China to fly back home, Bill received a visitor to wish him bon voyage. His name was Mao Zedong.
When I got ready to leave, why, Chairman Mao came down to the plane, and Chairman Mao gave me some Chinese rugs and told me that I was the only prisoner of war that had ever come through there from North China. This is a real fact. I tell somebody this and I didn't have the picture, it probably wouldn't go, but here it is. And they were very friendly to me.
Later that year, Bill's colleagues would also get to go home. Most of the Wake veterans were scattered across various prison camps in China and Japan when the war ended in August 1945.
This Jap colonel came in. He said, due to the great unhumanity of the atom bomb, the Emperor had granted peace to the world.
We flew to Atsuki Airfield, and at Atsuki was the only place I received psychological counseling. A Red Cross lady gave me a donut and a cup of coffee and smiled. And that, you know, was terrific.
The first thing I did was take the train into Chicago. I got to my mother's house at 10 o'clock at night. I knocked on the door, and my mother almost died of shock seeing me in the doorway. And that was my homecoming.
Why didn't you call her in advance?
I couldn't call her. She had no phone.
The only thing is that you lost so many days. I mean, that to me is, there's so many days of my life that were gone. And
that's the way we felt, that we lost that period of time that we were in prison camp.
We all came home with post-traumatic stress, and we didn't even know we had it. That is, instant anger could come up. Something happens and zoom, you're off, you say it. You are just not the same, never will be. A lot of marriages failed because of that.
I never thought we'd see so many of us left, though, being 80 years old, because after they had told us we probably wouldn't live long, so on.
Yeah, we were given a life expectancy of 50.
Wake Island. The Japanese garrison surrendered the island to U.S. forces on September 4th, 45.
Wake Island had been in Japanese hands for 3 years and 8 months before America reclaimed it at the end of the war. As soon as the formalities were over, American officers demanded to know what had happened to the missing 98 construction workers. The Japanese commander, Admiral Sakabara, told an elaborate lie about how they died in a U.S. bombing raid, but he was arrested and charged with their deaths.
The announcement happened right in front of me. The commander's face suddenly changed color.
When Sakabara's junior officers were also charged, they told the true story, some of them in suicide notes. Sakabara was tried for war crimes and hanged. Today, Wake remains a U.S. military post, one that's proud to welcome back its favorite sons.
They're really the ones who have built the mystique of the Marine Corps. It was the least we could do to try to show some sort of gratitude for everything that they've done for us. Very inspirational for the Marines that were here.
It just shows that, you know, the people remember, and it was, at the time, it was probably the only thing that gave the American people hope was our first victory here.
This is a time when I feel like this is serenity. It's a peaceful thing. And the fact that the government came back, and it did take this place, and here we are, and that's a great tribute to our country.
As World War II unfolded, bigger battles in Europe and Asia replaced Wake Island in the public consciousness. But it was Wake that set the tone for the victories to come, because it was here that the United States won its first battle of the war. And that will always give the men who fought it a special place in history.